Hopefully my screen hasn't frozen. Okay. Well, welcome everybody to session number 3 from our United States History to 1877. Today we're talking about chapters 7, 8, and 9 from module number 3. And I'm really excited because we're going to have more than just 2 participants today, and so hopefully we'll get some more conversation going. The objective for today's session, should be session number 3, is to explain 3 ways that cause and effect can be seen in history. And I chose this objective because when I was looking at chapters 7 and 8 and 9, I thought that there's a lot of examples in these chapters where we can see change over time and cause and effect, which is one of the historical thinking skills we want to try to extend to our students. So that's our objective for today. Off the top of our head, one of the things you might want to try if you teach this, or if you've read all of the materials, is to try and answer this at the beginning rather than at the end. Would anyone like to try to try and achieve our objective right off the top of the bat here, and give us at least one way that we can see cause and effect in chapters 7, 8, and 9? So that's fine. We'll come back to this, right? So let's think about cause and effect in history. So here's our agenda for today, right? So just a little welcome from me. We're a little bit behind schedule as it is. And then the connector, right, to kind of spark our own discussion for today is about democracy. Right, and in chapters 7, 8, and 9, we really see the growth and changes in American democracy, and we also learn a little bit about how the founding fathers viewed democracy as well. And so the connector for today is, what is a downside to democracy? Take a minute, think about it, and if you have a comment, please feel free to jump in.
Well, one of the interesting things that always starts for me is the fear of the mobocracy that some of the founding fathers had, that the education wasn't developed enough or shared, and that only people that were invested, property owners, could have the proper interest in what the government does. So they were very scared of the mob, just the uneducated, out of control, voting any way they wanted to, or that, the people they work for would have too much influence on how they voted.
Great. Very good. Wonderful, wonderful answer. Wonderful comment. Any other examples or ideas on some of the downsides to democracy?
I hate to get very political, but it's kind of an example of what's happening right now. I mean, in my view, so we have the 3 houses of government, right? But then we have a Democratic Congress, and so what that does is that it skews like the vote, or skews what their thoughts are, or their beliefs. Make the determination versus what the people really want. So there is a little bit of a problem. They're the representatives of the people, but they're actually potentially not. It's an assumption that they're going to do what's best for you, and there aren't really checks and balances in that. So in other words, if there's a bill that's put up and Congress passes it and the president passes it, where do the people come in to veto that and say, this isn't what we really wanted? Second to that is the policies that we have in place allow Congress, let's say, to push a bill through that has 2 good things and 3 bad things.
Right.
And that's where a problem comes in, because the good things may not be enough for the bad things to, the bad things can actually skew the good things, make it not worth it. So it's a real issue, with a democracy where it's almost like a mocracy of the government, that it's not it's for the people, by the people, but not necessarily, because we're a republic with the ideals of democracy, but it's not necessarily our voice. It's what we choose a person thinking that they're going to be our voice. It's not always the case.
Really well said.
And I would, if I could piggyback on that, the protection of the minority as well as the unforeseen consequences of political parties. And then is it America United allows corporations to donate to political parties like they are individuals?
Citizens United.
Citizens United, sorry, which is absolutely changing the foundation. And I would agree 100% that there are politicians acting for party rather than who they represent. And if they do try and represent, the party shuts off campaign financing. And that is a much bigger stick than the people you represent right now.
Wow.
That's very well said, too. Very well said.
Fantastic comments. Yeah, I would totally agree with everything that's been said. I really like the examples that were brought up. And to kind of bring it back, right, I think or to summarize a little bit of things that we've heard, democracy does allow for the will of the people. And that can be the mob, or it can also be the tyranny of the majority. Both of these things were warned about in ancient Greece and classical literature. And the Founding Fathers, of course, were very well versed in all of the classics and really, kind of tried to construct our form of government around, their understanding of the pitfalls that had befallen democracy in the past. And so we don't have a straight up democracy at the beginning of the country. We have this electoral college. We have these structures in place to make the will of the people to be stunted or even diverted or even ignored. And that's all by design. That the Founding Fathers were not fans of democracy. They were very much into a republic or even an oligarchy or even an aristocracy in some way, despite all of the language that they used in our founding documents that might imply otherwise. So good. Some downsides to democracy could be, that people vote for their self-interest rather than the national interest, right? And that the Founding Fathers were very afraid of a demagogue coming along and offering to, do things that couldn't possibly be done but sounded really exciting, and then getting elected based upon false promises. So, a demagogue. Okay, any comments, questions before we go on? All right,
No.
Great, wonderful start. So the next slide is just a little bit about the video lectures, the text and reading guides, the things we're going to be using today. And this is a standard part of our agenda. We typically go over the materials, and I wanted to see if you guys had any questions about any of those as well. There were 3 videos on the content, the text and reading guides, which are probably pretty simple for your level. I edited them for high school level readers. So I don't anticipate that you took the time to actually use those, but they are there because you're both educators that you should be, thinking about, could I use these in my course? And feel free to use any or all of them to your heart's desire. The more, sharing is really what it's all about. And then the live sessions and the recorded discussion questions I put on YouTube for you guys, and also on the Facebook page. And I want to encourage you guys and remind you to use the feedback form. You guys have been doing that so far, and I really appreciate that. It's really helping me make some changes. And I just want to add on that I've already kind of pre-launched the second course that I'm writing about history, and I've made some changes to that based upon the input you guys gave me. The second course is actually entitled Read, Write, and Use History, rather than just history to or history after 1877. I realize that the value of this course may not be in the content, but in the transformational education that can be passed on by educators like yourselves, right? More on how to read, more on how to write, more on how to use history rather than who won the War of 1812. So, any comments or questions on the materials for this week's session?
No.
Okay, great. Well, short and sweet. We'll move right along. Get into the good stuff. So, some comments on how to teach, the pedagogy of the learning around this course that I would highlight for you and for your students if you choose to use it. There are practice quizzes for this course, and I have to update Module 3. I don't think I put all the practice quizzes in there yet for Module 3, but they are coming. One of the things I would encourage you guys to try and do for your students or for your own sake is to take these practice quizzes before you read the text, right? So if you don't have time before our next session, try and do some of the practice quizzes online just to see what you already know. I think you're both, probably pretty well versed in U.S. history, and you might find that these are a good challenge or even just a good review. But for a student of yours, it could be a way for you to show what they know before they begin and to build on trouble spots that they might have based upon that pre-quiz. Obviously, flashcards are something that I've often, harped on to my students. I think I call it the fundamentals, the foundation. If you want to do nothing else in my class, I tell them to do the flashcards. But today, those are called Quizlets. And I'm sure you guys are maybe you've heard about Quizlet. It's basically online flashcards, and also Kahoot. This is something that I've recently adopted, and you probably are familiar with. But I've almost had to use it more frequently because the students ask for it. Like they really get into these Kahoots, and I was trying to figure out why. What is it about the Kahoots? Well, there's really exciting music. And it's competitive, right? And young people love to compete, even in fun ways, against each other. And so I would encourage you to think about ways to use the materials in a friendly, competitive way with the students. And if you think of any genius ideas, please share it with our Facebook group so that other teachers, students, and parents can learn from your insights. Also, I recommend. I often, when I'm helping students to learn and prepare, I encourage them to not only make notes, but use them. I think one of the things I have to identify for my students is that notes should be useful, not just did you do them. And that one test of your notes for a student would be to give them to someone else and have them look at the notes while you talk them through it. And so if your parent or friend can't make heads or tails of your notes, then you know that you might want to focus on taking better notes. They're not so useful. Notes should be a tool. And I tell the students, don't read the book more than once. Read the book, take notes, and be done with the book. Nobody would read that for fun. I mean, unless it's me. I read history books for fun, but most of my students would never read a book more than once for fun. So take notes and be done with the book, and you make sure your notes are worth it. Also, drawing a picture. I am very, very verbally oriented, very, very textually oriented as a learner, but not everyone is. And a lot of my students are artistically and visually oriented learners. And so one of the tricks I've had to use in the past is saying, okay, read the book for a minute or 5 minutes, whatever, and then pause and draw a picture of what comes to mind after you just read this, right? The physical act of drawing that picture can help a student to create that memory from which they can retain and draw upon later. And then a list of expectations, right? I ask students to project what do they anticipate this chapter is going to be about, or questions they have before going into it. So, for example, if we're looking at this slide, the chapter's about the market revolution, and there's a picture of a city and a bunch of steamships. So we might have them write me a question based upon what you see just from this image, right? And, they don't have to share that out, but it can be something that they go back to later. Maybe even call it like a personal exit ticket. Write me out your question, write me out your answer, give it to me when you leave. Okay, so that's it, short and sweet. Just a few tips on pedagogy for teaching the course. Are there any questions or comments? Additions?
I would add, I often give the boys open note quizzes the discussion I have to have with the students after an open note quiz is if you don't review the tool that you've created, that you're kind of a person that can't spell looking somebody's name up in the phone book, and that and then after open note quizzes, we slowly but surely move to them making every 3 or 4 pages of notes, make a logic web that reflects, or a quiz review page where they're predicting what I'll ask on the quiz. I often joke with parents on Parents' Night that we would think, we're making cheat sheets, but what it does is it encourages the boys to get back to the notes and say, like, this is my big point. This is the most important thing. This is what we spent time on. And as a student, to have them predict what will be assessed, does it match up with the essential question? Am I understanding which direction this learning's taking? Because then, we can go back and actively review their notes and what they were working on. And it's just, the reward is in the work then as well. Like if I'm taking great notes, if I'm following along and reviewing, wonderful.
Yeah, well said. Well said. Great tip, right? It reminds me of something I've done for years with my courses, because when you teach a high school level course, they give you a big textbook with a bunch of supporting elements to it, among them being a test bank, right? And I know testing is a big bugaboo in education, and I'm not all testing or no testing, but it is a skill, right? It is an educational skill, and so I do take time on it. And one way I do it, and it's kind of what you were talking about, the open note quizzes. At the start of a class, I might pick 3 multiple choice questions from the test bank that related to the previous night's reading. That'll be my warm-up exercise. I'll give them a little handout, a half sheet with 3 multiple choice questions on it, and I'll give them 5 minutes. And it could be open note, right? That's cool. Or it could just be, test yourself, what you retain. And then I take 5 minutes to go over each of the questions. And that becomes a little mini lecture, a mini review. And the students can mark not only what the right answer is, but what, they know if they got something wrong. So there's a little bit of metacognition that goes on with it too. And then the kicker is they keep those quizzes, right? That becomes a study sheet for them to prepare for the test, right? And I do pick some of those questions and put them on the test, right? So then there's like, oh, I remember seeing this in class. I remember studying for this. And so they're building towards something and learning about how, whether they, retained and could succeed on it. So anyway, great tip, John. Thank you. Any other comments, questions, or additions before we go on?
No.
Okay. Let's dive into the Early Republic. This is the Early Republic, chapter 7. And I sent out a lecture about my responses to these questions. So I'm going to give over more time to you guys and our discussion today. I'm really excited we have so many people here today. The first discussion question is, did the United States draw more from the vision of Alexander Hamilton or Thomas Jefferson? And the second question is, what were the causes and consequences of the War of 1812? Now, I picked 3 images here. One was of a canal. The other is of Republican motherhood. That's that image of the family down below. And then the third image is just Andrew Jackson, which he appears in this chapter, but there's a lot more to him to come in later chapters. But I just thought you can't ignore him. You got to talk about him whenever he shows up. So anyway, let's start with the first discussion question. Did the United States draw more from Alexander Hamilton or from Thomas Jefferson? What do you guys think?
I would say that we drew more from Alexander Hamilton, where I believe and usually say Hamilton is the skeleton and muscle system of America, and Thomas Jefferson is the spirit or will of America, the hope for. So I think his report on manufacturing, his vision of let's get in and compete worldwide, versus Jefferson, every man has to be a property owner and self-sufficient, that instead of, which is based on slave labor, that becomes more America gives every man opportunity or every citizen opportunity more than, Hamilton. Yeah, I believe we've adopted more from Hamilton a lot. And I often use the American system at the end of the repair for the mistakes of the War of 1812 to show like this is the Federalist Party coming back, operated by Democratic Republicans. So it's I like that.
Right. The politics couldn't ignore the policies that had already been put in place. That's interesting. What about you, MD? What do you think?
I actually exactly what he said, 100%. I was thinking the same thing. There's, depends on what your thoughts or your emphasis are, but I do believe that Hamilton really formed or shaped a lot of what the Republic was about, without being all for Republic, and honestly, it's blended and it's I think very well done. I can't imagine they're trying to be so different from England, right? So different from some of the policies that were there. I can't imagine recreating basically the Constitution or our political system from scratch. Some of it is borrowed, of course. It's borrowed from many nations, but I do see Hamilton's vision in most of it.
Yeah, I think that's a great comment. And since you both saw Hamilton as the answer to this question, I would just have to agree. I think in many ways you're right, and I think for me it also comes down to what extent is that good or bad, right? I mean, Hamilton's view of the United States economy is laid out for us in his report on manufactures and in his actions as the first Treasury Secretary. And it also begs the big what if. What if Hamilton had actually become president of the United States if he hadn't been killed? Would that have been a good thing or a bad thing for the future of the country? Considering his views on slavery, his views on manufacturing, his views on cities. But we do have Thomas Jefferson as president, right? We do have a two-term Jefferson presidency in which he kind of screws up the economy pretty badly. And does not really shine, although he does have some high points, right? I mean, you have to give him the credit for the Louisiana Purchase, and you have to give him credit for kind of keeping us out of those Napoleonic Wars, which might have been pretty bad for the United States. His neutrality was controversial and economically maybe a little bit devastating, but I think that's what this is all about, to kind of debate and to kind of evaluate. Oh, great. Any other comments or questions before we go on?
I would just add, Hamilton loses my support during the Whiskey Rebellion when he's convinced, like, I need a battlefield victory so I can be a Washington, and we need to hang these guys. Like, we need to make an example. And Washington kind of gets fed up and turns around and goes back. And we still have guys dragged through court cases. That's where Alexander Hamilton, like, his structure and development is great. I would, I have such a hard time saying that Jefferson did anything well. I kind of blame John Adams with the success of the Louisiana Purchase because he's the guy that signs the Convention of 1800. If we'd entered the war like the Democratic Republicans wanted us to, it would have been, well, and the Federalists wanted us to as well. And John Adams was that politician that steered the middle course and said, no, we developed the Army like we said we want it, and that's keeping us out of war. And he says, it's Washington's warning. If you want to avoid war, prepare to fight one, which is a quote from a Roman general, but so I think it's excellent. I think, and it really, being such a young nation, you see so much of the thinking laid bare for everyone, and you can track decisions being made.
Right. Well said. Well said. MD, anything else?
I was just going to say, I like the what if. I would really like to see what could have happened, what would have been a completely different scenario, and possibly joining the war. Not that I enjoy war by any means. I'm just saying that, you know, war does it is profitable in some ways, and there are things that would have united, I think, united us more. But not that I wanted us to go to war. That's not what it was about. But just the what if of it all, like what would have been different. I really like that thought.
Great comment. And we do end up going to war in 1812, and
In
the
1812,
unity
yeah.
that comes out of that is I think what you're referencing. You know, the war is the great uniter, for good or for bad. I agree with John. I think there's a lot not to love about Jefferson. I think he's a fascinating character in terms of being a historian, and how his reputation ebbs and flows depending on the time. You know, right now I think he's being dragged through the mud because of the Hamilton rap opera that doesn't really portray him very well. And obviously there's some substantial problems with Jefferson, with his slave owning and his presidential leadership. But you know, with Hamilton, I also see like maybe there's a little bit of historical generosity going on for him as well. I'm not a huge fan of Hamilton, although I respect his genius. Obviously, when you build an economy like he did, that's a testament to your genius. But in a sense, he was kind of a blowhard, kind of a fanatic. I mean, there's a reason everybody hated him. Not just the fact that he was a self-made man, which today we see as great, but back then they saw as really bad. But you know, remember, I kind of give up on Hamilton at the Constitutional Convention, where he tries to make Washington president forever, and the other representatives are sort of like, Hamilton, you don't get to talk anymore. you don't get to say anything after that, because he was so in love with this idea of Washington being the president. So I think he can be a little extreme. I think he's been given a rebirth because of the rap opera that celebrates big business and big money, and all of that is interesting. So anyway, for time, I want to respect your time. I don't want us to, I want to kind of move us along, but this is really fascinating, and I think we're off to a great start. Chapter 8 is next. Chapter 8 is the market revolution. And for this, I picked 3 slides. One was, of course, the Lowell Mills, which I think is hugely significant. The other is the telegraph. And then, of course, a steamship full of cotton. All of these, I think, were images that came to my mind when I read through this material about the market revolution. Our discussion questions for today are: did technology or migration do more to change antebellum America? And the other one is: how did the market revolution create social conflict? And I'm just realizing we skipped over the 1812 question. I apologize for that on the previous slide, but for time, I think we had to go on. So let's see if we can knock out these 2 questions in record time. What do you think about the first question?
I would say the first question, it's almost a yes answer to it, because it changes North and South so economically that you've got yourself down a box canyon and there's no easy way out. And there was migration into Louisiana, but the technology and the improvement in the North really puts almost a demand on Southern cotton, and the cotton gin, which is technology, instead of solving the slavery problem, I always say it's like Maxim and the machine gun. Like, nobody's ever going to fight war. They'll kill so many people. Well, guess what? We have an unintended consequence of the cotton gin makes cotton that much more valuable. Like, let's stop growing food and just totally, it's like colonial Virginia with tobacco. Don't worry about food. This makes us money.
Right. Good point. Very good point. MD, what do you think?
Along the same lines about technology. To me, it's more clear that technology it did more to change America. and the cotton. I thought the exact same thing actually that came to mind as I was thinking of that. The cotton gin, that it was easier to do that, to produce it and to work it. And then the demand became higher. You know, you're probably more, I mean, we are in a very capitalist society, so we just, when something breaks, we just go out and buy a new one. Back in that wasn't the case. You wore the same dress forever. You wore, you know, and now it's more available, and potentially if you have some affluence, you can just go ahead and buy a new one, you know. So I think that changed things as well. Not just clothing, of course, but that thought that things are more disposable than they ever were before.
Good. So I'm gonna play the role of the counter argument here, seeing as we're all kind of really focused on the technology, and that is I think is absolutely true, right? That cotton gin is one of the more significant examples of technology and unintended consequences that I try to impress upon my students, that no technology is without its downside, right? And these kids today, obviously, they love technology. They love their phones. There's nothing that could possibly be bad about their phone except when their teacher takes it away. But obviously, you know, there's a lot, you know, I've heard people say, you know, in 20, 30 years, they'll look back and say, how could you have given your child a cell phone, right? How could you have done that to them? Because I think we're going to understand the downside to that technology, just like we now understand the downside of the cotton gin, which at the time they may or may not have understood or even cared about a downside, because slavery, right? But migration, I think this is, really an important issue. As people begin to move west, the issue of slavery becomes one that can't be avoided. And there's a series of compromises that come primarily out of migrating west over, will this new state or territory be slave or free? And we see that with the Missouri Compromise, then later on with the Compromise of 1850, and then, you know, even the Crittenden Compromise just before the Civil War. They are trying to keep the country together as it expands, and the issue of slavery tears it apart. So I think the growth of the country may have actually destroyed the country, right? When Jefferson, right, back to our old friend Jefferson, when he hears about the Missouri Compromise, there's a famous quotation that I like to use with my students, not only because it makes them really kind of decipher language, but also question, right? He talks. You know it. You want to tell us about it?
Well, I mean, at that point, Jefferson's out, and he can really say, like, this is the death knell. This is the end. It's the bell ringing that is saying that this is the rock that the ship of America breaks on. And the Texas issue is just huge. I always review with my students the original Missouri Compromise that said, hey, Missouri can come in as a slave state, we'll give you the advantage, but if you agree to this, the slaves we have now are slaves for the rest of their life. Their children will be freed at the age of 25. And I point out that, you know, I assume that slave owners weren't the most nicest, kindest people in the world, and there would be people lying and continuing to not educate and, you know, possibly breeding. I mean, who was it? Jim Bowie was a smuggler of slaves. And, you know, so, but the understanding of limited abolition and solving a problem, it was a lot easier to compromise and say, like, let's make everybody happy. Maine will be free, Missouri will be free, and we'll keep the number even in the Senate so we can never, ever do anything.
Right. The downside to democracy, right?
Exactly.
Well, you know, just so MD, I don't know if you know this quote, right? So Thomas Jefferson, when he heard about the Missouri Compromise, he said, I reacted like a fire bell in the night, and I considered it at once to be the death knell of the Union, right? And so I use that quote, I show it to my students, because a fire bell, what's that? What's a death knell? And what does that mean to have the Missouri Compromise be a death knell in the night? These are great sort of, critical thinking questions, literacy-based questions, vocabulary for the students to wrestle with in a class. And I use this for 10 or 15 minutes, and we go into it, and then I leave them with a thought, and I ask them to think about it. And I've occasionally had them even write, what does it mean if the country died in 1820? Right? I mean, I present Jefferson as an expert. Right? Here's a guy who probably knows what the United States is. I mean, he was kind of important to the creating of the country.
Right.
And when he says the country just died in 1820, well, do you agree or disagree? And to what extent is he right? And if it's true that the country ended in 1820, then what country are we living in today? Right? Is it possible for a nation to end and not physically stop existing? Right? And that's periodization in history, right? There's something in history where, historians say, well, something started and something ended, cause and effect, change over time. And Jefferson's saying, look, my country ended in 1820. The country I started in 1776 ended in 1820. And from that point onward, we have a new nation where slavery is allowed to expand. So anyway, that's what I'm thinking of here. Now we have the other question here for how did the market revolution create social conflict? Do you guys want to touch on that quickly? Or should we go on to our last chapter for the day? We only have about 5 minutes left in this session.
I would say the market revolution, it just connects America throughout the world, gives the demand, furthers the demand for more mechanization, and increases the demand on slave labor. Like that is your resource that's driving the North, that's driving the tariff, that's connecting us to the world in the market revolution. Where the tariff is protecting home-produced goods at the expense of the South, which, makes a bigger wedge between North and South.
Okay, very good. MD, anything to add?
Not really. No. That makes a lot of sense.
Very good. Let's go on to chapter. This should be chapter 9. I think the slide is mislabeled. Excuse me. It should be chapter 9, but the title is correct. It's Democracy in America. And I chose a picture of Henry Clay and Andrew Jackson, King Andrew, as they called him, and then a picture of a political meeting showing the participation in democracy that was expanding in the 1820s. And the discussion questions for this chapter were, how did American democracy change in the 1820s? And is Andrew Jackson's presidency best understood as tragedy, triumph, or irony? Now, I'll just answer the first question because I really want to hear your thoughts on the second. And that's, American democracy changed in the 1820s because we expanded the right to vote to all white men. Still not democracy by definition, but now it's not landowning white men. Now it's all white men. And that's a huge expansion in terms of numbers of people who could vote. And sadly, we really don't live up to our idea of all men are created equal, all people are created equal for a long time. But this is going to have an effect upon our country. And Jackson is one example of that expansion of democracy. He was we call this the era of the common man in U.S. history. So I'd really like to know about your views on Andrew Jackson. Is his presidency a triumph, a tragedy, or an irony, or even something else? What do you guys think?
I come down. I think he is that demigod that we were warned about. That the Electoral College is going to protect us from. I think being a war hero, being the conqueror of Florida, who then has to apologize and give it back, and a guy who so New Orleans, he uses the Barton pirates. He confiscates slaves to use them to build the fortifications of Notre Dame or New Orleans. But then his presidency, he vetoes more than anybody else. He's the first guy to have an assassination attempt. and he walks across the guy and beats him down to the ground with his own walking stick, and then steps over the guy's body. And the common man, the mythology of him being in the British prison, his brothers both die. His father dies before he's born, and then John Quincy Adams, the dirty deal, that the inside Washington rigged this election. He gets 4 years to run against John Quincy Adams. It's just amazing. And then, really importantly, being from Philly, the second bank of the U.S. is a not a good model of the banking system, and we don't have a Treasury Department we don't have a Treasury at the time. So, the hard currency and the specie and the pet banks, just incredible that the government is not fully developed yet, I guess. And he is almost a personal vendetta with Biddle, and I'm going to kill the bank, and if it's the last thing I do. And then poor little magician suffers the economic crash, and is standing there saying, like, well, we're the party of pull yourself up by your bootstraps, so we're not really going to do anything. So then you get Harrison, who says, well, I'm more frontier than Van Buren. So it's really neat, and it's where symbols start really running politics. So it's an interesting, come together of and birth of political parties. It's a nice time period to really have students dig in and consider.
Good. Thank you, John. MD, you want to share what your thoughts are on Jackson?
Yeah. So a lot of what John said is pretty much what I was kind of thinking, or trying to formulate in my head. But I do believe that this may be the start of our political parties. I don't want to say split of it, but as the country died and all of that, maybe that's not necessarily a bad thing, because it was expanding, right? And changes had to be made. So yeah. So as you're talking about that, it was kind of going through my head, like maybe not necessarily, I don't want to say it wasn't a bad thing, but boy, he sure had his views, his points, and stuck to it completely, which, good or bad, made some changes, made things happen. So yeah, I don't really have much more to say, because that's literally what I was thinking. In fact, almost systematically what I was thinking John was saying. I was like, oh wow. So I don't have much more to add.
Well, great.
I think one thing that's really interesting as well, the Trail of Tears, he totally approves it but never orders it. He lets somebody else carry that handbag. And then the Force Act with the Tariff of Abominations, where he's got great quotes. I'll make South Carolina look like a Christmas tree, and I'll hang anybody that argues with it. Like, he's phenomenal as a person to study. But I would say, that very similar to Jefferson, he almost sets up failure for someone else.
Yeah.
So I think he's a really interesting person. And then you can always bring back compromise, and the compromise tariff, neither side wins. Everybody's happy. And, even his birthday quote, our union, it must be preserved. And that's a threat to Calhoun at his birthday party. He's been a great guy to hang out with.
Never invite Andrew Jackson to your birthday. I think that's the lesson of history. Just don't. He ruins the party for everybody. Jack. I find there's a reason Jackson is on the 20, and it's not because he's a violent racist, genocidal killer. It's that he had a profound influence for good or for bad, and I tend to see him as almost a warning, right? I mean, because he does come in as this demagogue of the people and really shows us how the expansion of democracy can lead to an election of of a popular candidate, but maybe not the best candidate for the nation. And then his policies, right? His policies are all over the place. And tell me if this sounds familiar, but somebody who tells you all kinds of things and does all kinds of crazy, scandalous actions, and then leaves the country in a shambles and declares himself victorious.
The kitchen cabinet is like, it's very scary. Like, I'm not going to use my appointed and approved cabinet. I'm going to have my drinking buddies, gambling friends help me make decisions.
Well, no, that's Warren Harding, if I'm not mistaken, is the kitchen cabinet.
But Andrew Jackson had a kitchen cabinet as well.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, there's a lot about that he had specific friends who kept him informed.
Right. That he wasn't one for institutions, I guess.
And I always like he and Davy Crockett had a huge fallout.
I didn't know about that. That's interesting.
And Sam Houston was supposed to be the next Jackson, but he goes to Texas and becomes the.
You know what? Well, we'll get to that story probably next week. We can talk about Sam Houston in Texas, because that's a great story and one I love to share every year. You know, one of the things, though, just to wrap us up, is that, you know, Jackson is obviously very relevant to today, and I make this point to my students because I tell them one of the mantras from history is that first things matter. Right? When you see something happen for the first time in history, pay close attention, because it establishes a tradition and an expectation for what to expect going forward. And obviously Jackson is sort of the first president elected when you expand democracy. So you're going to maybe see more demagoguery, more party politics, more upheaval. But also for today, well, Donald Trump, the first thing he did was to go to Jackson's grave and visited Andrew Jackson's gravesite. And he hangs Andrew Jackson's picture in the Oval Office. He is very much he sees himself very much as an Andrew Jackson-like figure. And for good or for bad, right? I mean, you have to decide for yourself. I think we all have our opinions. I don't want to necessarily go down that road in this forum, but when presidents latch on to historical examples, it does give us, you know, something to go by in terms of what to expect. And I hate to think that the economy might collapse like it did after Andrew Jackson left, but now there's some suggestion that might happen too. So I don't know. History is, as I tell people, it's a great way to understand the present, and it's a wonderful guide stone for making decisions about the future. And so I think with that, I'll just move us into our last slide, our summary, and I won't take much time on this to just say more than there is a reflection survey for this session. Please fill it out to the best of your ability. It's linked in the agenda that I sent out. And our next session is next Monday. It'll be at the same time, 11:30. And then in the reflection, if the time doesn't really work for you, you know, if 11:30 doesn't really work for you, then please let me know a better time that we can do these sessions that does work for you, so we can get more people involved. And don't forget, we do have that Facebook group. Please, if you do use Facebook, try and use it. It's a great resource. Otherwise, I don't recommend Facebook. But for our purposes, I would. Anyway, I think that's going to be it for us today. I apologize. We're a couple minutes over. Any last comments or questions before we end?
Thank you very much. Have a great week.
Thank you. Thank you, MD. Have a great week.
Thank you.
All right.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.